Welcome to Sports Management Podcast, where you will hear interesting sports management professionals share their stories, experiences, and passion for the sports management industry. I am your host, Marcus Philipson. Welcome to episode 183 of Sports Management Podcast. Today's guest is Kearnan Myall, the performance director at GB Snowsport. Kearnan is a former professional rugby player who transitioned into the business setting of sport, now focusing on maximizing performance at GB Snowsport. He's also a PhD researcher at Oxford University, and his research concerns the application of mindfulness-based interventions to improve depression in elite athletes. We spoke about transitioning from athlete to a business setting, his leadership style, the relationship between mental health and athletic performance, his own period of depression, and much more. Kearnan Myall, welcome to the Sports Management Podcast.
Great, thank you for having me.
It's great to have you on the show. You are the performance director at GB Snowsport. So can you tell us a little bit about GB Snowsport and your role?
Absolutely. So our organization essentially supports all top-class skiers and snowboarders in Great Britain. We currently work across what we call world-class programs. So these are programs that are funded by UK Sport, essentially the government, and they range from snowboard cross, ski cross, and typically the freestyle disciplines, so ski and snowboard, halfpipe and big air and slopestyle. But then we also look after alpine and cross-country as well. So it's a really quite broad-ranging scope of our activities. And then beyond that, there are other disciplines as well, like telemark. And then we have the grassroots and all the infrastructure that goes down into the ski academies across Europe, obviously, because there are not huge amounts of mountains and snow in the UK.
And in your role as performance director, what do you bring to the table for GB Snowsport?
So my role it's quite interesting. It's actually different in different national governing bodies in the UK. And I've been in the performance director role since April. And before stepping into it, I spoke to different performance directors from different roles, different organizations. And the role is very dependent on the specific requirements of that sport. So for me, and with the skills that I have, I am very much performance focused. It's the name is in the title, but a lot of performance directors are a little bit further removed from performance, maybe, and kind of work on the governance side of things. But with my background as an athlete in professional sport, I very much kind of utilized the skills and experiences that I had as an individual and kind of put that to the forefront in the decisions that I make regarding essentially where we put our resources, which athletes we support, which programs we support, and how we optimize each individual athlete's program to give them the best chance of ultimately delivering medals at World Championships and at the next Winter Games in Milan.
Yeah, so Milan-Cortina in 2026, obviously you're working really hard for that. You mentioned your background, so I think before we go into the preparations for Milan-Cortina, maybe we should talk a little bit about your background, because you don't have a snow sport background. You were a pro rugby player for many years. So can you tell a little bit your journey and what knowledge and things you have learned that you now can implement in this role?
Yeah, of course. I've learned a lot. I'd never actually skied or snowboarded when I started working with GB Snowsport. So I literally knew nothing and had never done it. So my background is in professional rugby. As a youngster, I just loved sport, and I played lots of different sports. Rugby was always the sport that I gravitated back to, probably because I'm tall. I'm 2 meters and 6'7", and rugby was always a sport that naturally I was good at. I quit a few times as a kid to play football and to go mountain biking, and I had a choice to make when I was about 15 between basketball and rugby. And I actually was offered a contract for £100 a month for Leeds Carnegie Academy. So that was the hook that got me into playing rugby full time. From then, I went on and played 15 seasons of professional rugby in the English Premiership. Had a few appearances for England rugby, not as many as I would have liked to, but I certainly had a playing career that I was very proud of. Rugby, for those of you that know the game, is a tough sport, and it requires an enormous amount of discipline across pretty much every element of elite performance in sport that you can imagine. You need to be fit, you need to be strong, you need to be mentally tough, you need to have good hand-eye coordination, power endurance, speed, agility, kind of everything. Rugby really is an all-encompassing game. So I think the day-to-day practices of being a professional rugby player set me up really well to transition into the management side of sport. I think a lot of athletes will, during their playing careers, just kind of follow their nose, in the sense that the coaches will tell them to do things, their physios will tell them to do things, and they do it, and that's great. But for me, I was somebody that I was probably a bit of a pain as an athlete, because I questioned things a lot and I wanted to understand the reasons why. And I did that honestly for my own personal gain as an athlete. And then what I realized coming out the end of my playing career is that I had not only this experience of being a professional athlete, but skills and knowledge that I'd accumulated over my playing career. For example, when I got injured, I wouldn't just do what the physio told me. I'd go and research my injury, and then I'd ask questions about the rehab I was doing. And, oh, have you thought about this? Could I do that? And often it was a case that the physios knew far better than me. And they said, well, that research is out of date now. But just the fact that I'd gone out of my way and learned this and read this, it equipped me with a huge amount of knowledge that I've been able to, so far, quite successfully apply into the decisions that I make in the different roles that I've had within GB Snowsport over the last few years.
So do you think there is a difference now when you're working with, maximizing performance, that you're working with a different sport, or is it still, a lot of similarities that you can draw from your rugby career to a snow sport?
I always say it's about 50-50. It's about 50% completely and utterly different. So obviously skiing and snowboarding, from a strategic and technical perspective, there are very, very few similarities with rugby, other than you just need to be physically robust and relatively fit. But even then, within the programs that we support in snow sports, you have cross-country skiing, where you have athletes with huge VO2 maxes per kilogram of body weight, and they are really sort of the pinnacle of discipline and elite sport. And then you move a little bit further and you've got alpine racers who also need a very big VO2 max and are extremely disciplined in their training. And then you move a bit further and you have the freestyle athletes who don't have a good VO2 max at all. They don't really bother with cardiovascular training because they don't need to. They're fit and strong and they train, but they're not athletes in the same way that a cross-country athlete is, because they don't need to be. They need to be more creative and push themselves in different ways. And with that in mind, the similarities to rugby start becoming a bit more clear, because a lot of rugby players are not necessarily amazing athletes. They're just tough people that have developed skills and have discipline and tenacity and apply that in the context of rugby. So coming into snow sports from rugby, it was actually fairly easy for me to see, okay, these skills and these experiences from rugby are directly applicable and are really, really useful. But it was, like I say, very easy for me to identify where I didn't have the knowledge of the sport, because I just did not have the knowledge. So I could ask the stupid questions and I could get people to explain things to me at a really, really basic level. And then from there, over the years, I've sort of increased my understanding of snow sports and the different disciplines and the little nuances between freestyle ski and freestyle snowboard. There are cultural differences, and it's taken me 3 or 4 years to understand those differences. I still can't coach anyone how to ski or snowboard, and I never will be able to, but I don't need to do that because we have some of the world's best coaches. So it's drawing on the experience around you and probably identifying the areas that you don't have that skills and knowledge, and relying on people around you that do. I think that's one of the areas that has really helped me in my development.
Yeah, it's a team effort. It's that's what I think most people know, but like there are huge teams around, a national governing body and national teams and everything.
Yeah, absolutely.
So yeah, we mentioned Milan-Cortina 2026. We're just in 2025 here. So now it gets more and more intensive, I guess, working towards that. So how does your work now look like with the preparations towards Milan-Cortina?
It's getting intense. It's definitely getting intense. In rugby, we would call it the business end of the season. So as you enter the kind of the final quarter, everyone gets a bit anxious and nervous, and it's an excited feeling. It's really cool. Whereas in Olympic sports, because the Olympics are 4 years apart, it's much longer. So now we're entering the final year, and you start feeling the pressure increasing. Everyone's a bit more excited and a bit more edgy. You have those kind of nagging doubts in the back of your mind around, are people going to get injured? Is the prep that we're doing the right prep? But we've been we've been on a really strong upward trajectory since the last Olympics in Beijing, where we underperformed, and we've had some really, really, well, historically great results in terms of British skiing and snowboarding. So the work that we're doing now is essentially built on the foundation of the last 2 years. So for me personally, I have a huge amount of travel coming up at the end of the month. I'm basically from London, Europe, back, America, back, Europe, back, just kind of continually until around April, May. We have various world championships coming up, which is a real good marker for where we're at as an organization in terms of our performances leading into Milan. So it's almost sectioning it off and understanding that, yes, we have Milan coming up in 12 months' time, and that's huge, but there are 3 or 4 different stepping stones on that road still. So kind of breaking it down into little chunks and making sure that everything that we're doing up until the end of February is as optimal as it can be. And then from February, okay, great. All our athletes are fit, healthy, winning. Let's do the same. Let's build on that. And I think that's probably the common theme throughout all professional sport is the consistency of your daily practices that really makes a difference. And it's quite easy to get distracted by a big event in the future, i.e. Milan, but equally you need to be making sure that all your steps are leading to the end goal. And it's an art as much as a science, I would say.
Yeah, definitely. And that's for goal setting at large, right? You have a big goal and then you're putting smaller goals as you go.
Yeah, completely. And they have to be changeable as well, because like especially in snow sports, competitions get cancelled all the time. That's a big one due to weather conditions. It's a bit less so in other sports. But in all sports, you need to have flexibility within those goals, because sometimes you achieve them early as well, which is great. And then you have to set new goals. And equally, sometimes you get halfway on the route to achieving a particular goal and you realize that it's probably not as realistic as you first thought. But again, that's the beauty of sport.
For sure. So performance can be physical performance, mental performance. How are you working and mixing these two?
That's a good question, because the foundation of, I suppose, my unique selling point, if I was going to describe it as that, in terms of how I direct performance as a performance director, is I probably weight the mental side slightly more than the physical side. And what I mean by that is, we discussed sort of experts in the field earlier. There's an abundance of experts, physiologists, physios, medical doctors, strength and conditioning coaches, nutritionists, biomechanics, that have a hugely in-depth knowledge on physical performance. And that's fantastic, because we as an organization have access and we employ many of these people, and the UK Sports Institute have huge numbers of experts in this area, and we draw upon their expertise on the physical performance side of things. But for myself, as a rugby player, what I realized during my career is that the psychological side of performance is, the resources that are put into it are vastly disproportionate, physical to psychological. And that has changed over the last few years, which is really good. But I still would say that it is lacking. And there's still, broadly speaking, a misunderstanding of the psychological factors that make up optimal performance. That's some of the research that I'm doing myself in my own time. And I think that is possibly one of the areas where we as an organization, GBS, have managed to utilize support in that area in quite a progressive manner. And it's probably contributed to some of the continued success that we've had over the last few years as well.
Yeah, because you have, it is elite athletes. So you need to have, everything is elite, but still, if the mental part is not there and not getting burned out, and how can you find that? And the mental health aspect is, I think nowadays you talk more about it, maybe not enough still, but maybe a couple of years back, this was barely considered. So it feels like we are, as you said, that you are leaning more towards the mental part than the physical part. I feel like in general, that's how people see things nowadays.
Definitely. And the reason that I have that personal focus on that is from my own experience as a rugby player. And going back 10 years, like you just said, people didn't speak about it. And as a rugby player, I had a period of my career where I was suffering with depression. And interestingly, it didn't necessarily affect my performance in individual matches. I still sometimes played really well. But what it did do is affect my my overall behaviors. And as I was mentioning before, as an athlete, you have to have consistent elite performance behaviors day in, day out, 24 hours a day. That's your job. And when you're struggling with depression and anxiety, you do start making poor decisions. And it might just be that you stay up a bit late staring at your phone, or it might be that you go out and drink more alcohol, or do things that are tangibly detrimental to your performance. And I think those are the things that are still probably to a degree misunderstood, broadly speaking, in sport. There is research going on now, and I think there's a much better awareness of the effect that mental health has on performance, not just in a competition, but kind of on an athlete's overall life. And they're not easy to fix, but if we're considering the amount of resource that gets put into the marginal gains approach taken to physiological performance, there are much, much lower hanging fruit on the psychological side of things, in both in my experience and in practice and in research, in fact.
Because this is your PhD research as well, right, on this topic?
Yeah, that's correct.
What is it more like exactly the thesis on the PhD?
Broadly speaking, I'm looking at the relationship between mental health and performance in elite athletes. Again, I mentioned I experienced a period of depression during my own career. And again, linking back to what I mentioned before, when I was diagnosed with depression, firstly, I didn't think I could be depressed because I was a professional athlete, and the stigma that was around mental health at that period of time, I was terrified that anyone would find out that I was depressed, because I thought that I wouldn't be trusted. I thought that I'd lose my contract and I wouldn't be picked. So I hid it. And it wasn't a useful thing to hide. And as I was mentioning before, I made some bad decisions and ultimately was kind of forced to go and see a psychiatrist who diagnosed me with depression. And off the back of that, I then went away and started researching depression and how to improve my own life and to sort of treat it as if I would treat an injury, and do everything that I could to alleviate myself of the symptoms that were causing me such distress. And the vast majority of research that I found, or information that I found on the internet, were things that kind of we all understand: making sure you're staying socially connected with people, making sure you're exercising, making sure you're eating healthy, sleeping, not drinking, taking drugs, etc. So as a professional athlete, I was doing all of those things anyway. So there were very few bits that I could add on top. But one thing that kept coming up over and over again was meditation. So I thought, at this point, why not? So I started meditating. I realize now that for the first probably 2 years that I was doing it, I wasn't meditating properly. I was putting on something from YouTube or some nice sounds and sitting there with my eyes closed, often falling asleep, waking up, feeling a bit better and thinking I was doing it. And since then, I've been meditating for about 10 years. And I've been out to Nepal, and I've spent time in a Buddhist monastery and sat in silence for 4 days and had deep conversations with teachers about how to formally practice meditation and how to really reap the benefits of it. And it's something a little bit like physical training, that if you go to the gym and do a load of sit-ups, you're not going to walk out with a six-pack. But if you go to the gym every day for 6 months and do a load of sit-ups, providing your diet's all right, you probably are going to end up with a six-pack. And that's what meditation is like. It's something that you need to do repeatedly over time. So my research is employing what we call mindfulness-based programs, so meditation-based programs that have been adapted typically from a medical setting. So using MBCT, it's called mindfulness-based cognitive therapy, in medical settings with people with diagnosed depression, adapting those programs with a performance-focused element for elite athletes, and then essentially teaching elite athletes how to meditate and how to integrate those practices into their day-to-day life. So my PhD itself has been 3 studies. The first one was looking at the correlation between trait mindfulness, so essentially how naturally mindful we are as individuals. I was looking at rugby players specifically in that instance, and as you might imagine, individuals who were more mindful on a day-to-day basis. And what I mean by that is, if you're somebody that has the propensity to worry about the future a lot, then you're probably going to be slightly more anxious than average. If you're somebody who ruminates a lot about past mistakes, or you're thinking about conversations you had yesterday where you said something stupid, that tends to correlate slightly higher with people who are depressed. So if you're somebody who can remain in the present moment naturally, without necessarily having to practice meditation formally, then you typically will see lower levels of mental health issues in individuals like this. So that was kind of the foundation of my research. I then did a big systematic review where you essentially write a research question and you go out and you collect enormous amounts of data, screen it, compile it, and then reanalyze it. And this was across all athletes, all sports. And I was looking at the relationship between mindfulness-based programs. So actually, when you sit athletes down and you formally teach them how to meditate, and they practice it for an extended period of time. For my study, it was programs that were over 4 weeks long, up till about 12 weeks. And the results were aggregated and really quite strongly confirming the positive effects of mindfulness-based practices to reduce stress, depression, anxiety, and increase objective performance markers as well, and just through focus, attention, control. People call it flow. So the ability to remain present while you're practicing. So for me, it's sort of seemingly obvious. You spend a little bit of time learning how to meditate, make sure you're kind of developing those skills, 10 minutes a day in your daily routine. And as I mentioned before, in terms of low-hanging fruit and performance, you're getting so much more bang for your buck. Firstly, because it's free, and secondly, because it's incredibly effective, pretty much broadly speaking. So that's something in terms of my research. My final project was implementing a mindfulness-based program with one of our ski teams. I'm analyzing that at the moment, but we've done lots of practices, similar based practices with different members of our squad. And yeah, it's fair to say I don't want to champion it too much because it's my own research, but I get no benefit from it. It's not like I'm selling anything. I think it's just for any sports practitioners out there, it's like I keep saying, a really low-hanging fruit that improves not just performance, but improves the well-being of your athletes and practitioners too.
Yeah, definitely. No, that's super interesting, and a lot of New Year's resolution this time of year. So maybe meditation should be something to add on to your training and wellness routine.
Yeah, for sure. I think the biggest stumbling block people find is what I mentioned before. They'll sit down and they'll meditate, and then they finish and they feel the same. So they're like, well, what's the point in doing that? And they might even do it for a week, or they might even do it for a year, and you don't notice any difference. But it really is something that compounds over time, and the transformation that it can potentially provide to people is enormous, but it just takes that daily dedication. And I think that's the stumbling block for most people, I would say, that consistency.
You know, you mentioned that you do obviously the PhD thing, and when you were injured, you were doing your own research for finding out, like, can I find a different way? How can I rehab better? Where do you think this curiosity comes from, that, you know, you're always chasing more knowledge and learning more?
Yeah, I'm not sure, actually. Maybe my dad. I'm a curious person. I have lots of different interests outside of sport. When I played rugby, for example, a lot of my teammates played rugby. That was their job. That was their life. They would then go home and watch rugby. They would know all the players. They'd watch rugby on a weekend. They'd go take their kid to rugby on Sunday when they weren't playing. That's what their life was. But for me, I was always interested in so many other things. I studied 2 degrees that were nothing to do with sport while I was playing rugby. I've had businesses and things outside of rugby as well, and I still do. And I also think that having a really broad range of interests allows you to take lessons and teachings and learnings from other disciplines and apply those to your sport or whatever practice it is that you're doing. So and a lot of people that I work with ask me how I have time to do all these things or why I do all these things. But in my mind, at least, the different avenues that I kind of spend my time researching or reading or learning about, it's all kind of for the common same purpose, which is, in my instance, helping talented individuals be better at what they're already good at.
And it's about prioritization, right? Like we all have 24 hours. It's about how we prioritize them. And people say, I don't have time to go to the gym. You do, but you don't prioritize it. That's the truth. And obviously you prioritize learning and knowledge and, the mental aspect of things. So then you put time to that.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't know if you can see my background, but this is my front room. I don't have a TV, so I don't watch TV. So when people say they don't have time, I never ask this because it's a bit of a challenging question. But I would love to say, well, how many hours Netflix do you watch? Like, show me how long you're on Instagram on your phone each day, because it's probably going to be a few hours for the average person. If that's a few hours that you can do spending something different. And by all means, people need to relax and watch TV and stuff. I'm not against that by any stretch of the imagination. But there are just, different priorities, I guess, like you're saying.
Yeah, definitely. No, I think like what screen time is 4 or 5 hours on an average person, and then for sure you have a 2-3 hour Netflix as well. So that's a full day. That's 7 hours that you. That's a working day that you're putting on something else. So it's and I'm no better myself. I'm not saying that I'm doing that for sure, but
exactly. I stare at my phone as much as the next person.
Yeah, and then but then as you said, then it's more about priorities than or prioritization more than having time or not.
For sure.
You have mentioned some injuries and some things like that, but has there been any other bumps on the road in your career, and how did you overcome them?
I think there are lots of specific examples I can give, but nothing that really stands out. I would say if I'm bringing them together, the bumps in the road tend to come down to human interactions a lot of the time. And to back that up, one of the main challenges we're having at the moment in my current organization is that we're all aware of the cost of living crisis. Things are becoming more expensive across the globe. So when you're working in a sport like skiing that is already expensive, it is a lot more expensive. So resources are a big difficulty for us at the moment, in the sense that if we had more money, performance would objectively be better. There are things like that where you can control some of it and you can't control other parts of it. And that's relatively simple for me because you focus on the things that you can control, which is going out and, in our instance, bringing in commercial revenue. And you kind of forget about the things that you can't control, the fact that costs are going up. We're never going to be able to do anything about that. So those bumps in the road are just sort of like practical management challenges that you need to direct. I think a lot of the challenges that I faced during my rugby career, when I reflect on them now, were because of, like I said before, human interactions, relationships, challenging relationships with coaches or with other players. And it's always easy to look back on past examples and think you could do things differently. But I think the approach that I take in my day job now is that I will speak to people and I will have honest and open conversations with them. Whereas when I was playing rugby, I shied away from a lot of those conversations. So for example, if I didn't get picked, I would either ignore the coach and just be in a mood and go out and train really hard, or I would go into the office really angry and demand, like bang my fist and demand why I wasn't picked. And then that inevitably elicits a kind of reactionary response where it becomes a like you're going against each other and you're each getting defensive. Whereas now, when I disagree with somebody or I sense somebody's disagreeing with me, because often I'm the person that's making the decisions and I hear somebody's disagreed with me or somebody rings me up and telling me that they disagree with me, the first thing that I try and do is listen to them because, and kind of going back to what we spoke about before, I'm not from snow sports and there's a lot that I don't know. So if I've done something that someone disagrees with, my first thought is, tell me why. I want to know why, because maybe you're right and maybe I need to change my decision, or maybe I need to factor it into the next decision. And what I've learned from that is, even in situations where I know I'm right, with sort of speech quotes, because you don't always know, but where I very much strongly think I'm right, listening to other people's reasons and opinions is very helpful. Firstly, because you might figure out you're wrong, but secondly, in disarming them, because once they've said what they've got to say, often the bump in the road, if that's what we're talking about, becomes a bit flatter. And then you've given somebody the space to speak. And I say, okay, well, I understand what you've said there to these points. And then kind of I explain my rationale and my reasoning. And then suddenly that bump in the road becomes much flatter. So there are bumps in the road constantly, and it has been a bumpy summer for us as an organization, as I mentioned, mainly around finances and having to make really tough decisions on where we put our resources and having really tough conversations with athletes and coaches and staff around how we're going to be adjusting performance plans this year. And it's mostly not been positive news for the majority of our squads because we've had to tighten our belts. But I feel as though as an organization and personally in my own position, I think we'd mostly manage those bumps in the road quite well just by having upfront honest and direct conversations. And you're never going to get it right, and you're never going to make everybody happy. And those bumps are always going to exist. But if you can just, like I say, if you can just mellow the bumps a little bit more, then when the big unavoidable bumps come that you can't do anything about, they're a little less unsettling. And that's what I'm finding so far. But for me, it's a very new thing, because I've been in the position that I'm in for less than a year. So I'm learning a lot. And that's all part of the experience and part of the enjoyment, I find as well.
Yeah, and I think that's a great trait for a leader as well, to be open-minded and to listen to your team. Of course, you might have the final say in things, but not to be, just being, you have an idea and then you stick with it just because, but you're actually open-minded to have listen to your team and then make a decision based on getting all the data possible.
Absolutely. And I think now you've said that, that's probably part of the reason why I didn't stay working in rugby, because the vast majority of people in the management side and the coaching side of rugby have come from rugby, like way above 95%, I would say, pretty much everyone. And I think when you stay in that type of environment, you're very sure of what you know and what you don't know. And that is not always a good thing. It's often not a good thing. So it's hard to change people's mind, and people become quite close-minded. So I think rather than it being a natural skill that I had coming into the role, it was honestly the fact that I didn't know a lot about the sport that allowed me to be open. And then from that, I kind of saw the benefits of having open conversations with people and listening to people. Yeah, and the benefits that can bring.
Yeah. No, that's really interesting. So as someone now has been in on the management side for a while and been in the sports industry for a long time, what is some advice you would give a young person who has aspirations to work in the sports industry?
I would say the first thing is make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. And only the individual knows that. If you're doing it because you think it's cool and you think it's fun, and that's the only reason, then you might need to reflect if that's a good enough reason. And the reason I say that is because professional sport is tough. It is really, really tough. So it is super fun and it is super cool, but that's kind of the icing on the cake. And the rest of the cake is a lot of hard work and it is a lot of stress. And honestly, for the majority of people that work in professional sport, you're probably not going to get paid as well as you could in other areas. I think it probably gets a bit skewed by the superstars that we all know about, that get paid enormous amounts of money. But actually, for practitioners, the vast majority of people that work in sport could probably get paid more working outside of sport and have a more kind of typical 9-to-5 lifestyle if that's what they want. So I think it's really important that if you want to go into professional sport, it's for the right reasons. I would say be prepared to work very hard. You have to go above and beyond. You have to work weekends, you have to work evenings, you have to not go to your best friend's wedding sometimes because the competition's on. And these are just sacrifices that unfortunately you will have to make if you're working in professional sport for a long time. And then beyond that, I would say that professional sport is a little bit like a bubble. And when you're on the outside of the bubble, it's really difficult to get in. So the more connections that you can make with people, just honestly, email, like if you can get people's contact details, if you know of someone that knows somebody, ask to have conversations, go and sit and have a coffee with someone, ask if you can go to a training center and watch what they do for a day. All of that is firstly good experience to have, but then secondly, the network is super important in sport as well. Because once you're inside that bubble, then you're inside it, and then that's your job and that's your life, and you know all these people, and you can bounce around from professional rugby to professional skiing and snowboarding, for example. And then once you're in, the great thing about professional sport, I would say, is that it is for the most part a genuine meritocracy. The best people will get to the top, in the same way that the best sports teams typically win the competitions.
Yeah, for sure. And that's one of the many reasons why we love it. But as you said, with the networking part, obviously really, really important. And I like to ask a networking question also on this podcast. So someone from your network, who do you think would be a good guest on this podcast?
I give two. I have a couple, actually.
Yeah.
One of them is a very close friend. His name's Simon McIntyre, plays professional rugby at Sale Sharks. He also has so he's still playing professional rugby. He also has an MBA and has been out at Harvard doing various business courses. He is on boards for ED&I, sort of diversity of thought. And I mean, he's just one of my really close mates, but we have very in-depth conversations along the lines of the stuff we're talking about now. And I enjoy it because I'm talking to somebody who's actually doing it on a day-to-day basis. So yeah, you can read a paper about something that may improve performance, but actually talking to someone who's going out and putting their body on the line every week, that's the sort of feedback that makes a difference to me. So I think that could be a really interesting conversation. And then one of my other friends / former colleagues, he was actually my strength and conditioning coach at London Wasps when I played there. And funnily, I was mentioning before how I was a bit of a difficult athlete. He definitely will have found me a very difficult athlete to coach for, because I used to question his program all the time. I used to complain about it. We had a really good professional working relationship, but I wouldn't say we were friends. And then since we've gone off in our different careers, we've actually become good friends. And Nick Chad is now I think he's head of performance. I don't remember his exact title, head of sports science and medicine or head of performance at Chelsea football team. He was at Benfica out in Portugal before. And again, have some really, really interesting conversations with him about sport and performance. And obviously the resources that they have in football is just super interesting to hear about what they can do and kind of really at the cutting edge of sports analysis.
Definitely. No, wow, that's two great names. Hope to make that happen at some point.
Sure.
Closing in here, Kearnan, anything that you feel like I haven't asked, something I missed, or something you want to point out, shine some extra light on?
We could talk, there was one of the points you mentioned around transition. So my transition from rugby, I think any elite athlete transitioning out of a career in professional sport is a challenge. You were a certain person for one way and you live your life a certain way for such a long time, and then suddenly all the structures and all the motivation and all the reasons for you behaving that way disappear, and it becomes really challenging because you have to reflect on, why was I doing this stuff? Why was I eating chicken and broccoli for dinner every night? And now I don't want to eat chicken and broccoli for dinner every night. What do I eat? So really simple things like that become quite challenging. And then you have to go into a new career or a different career, whether that's in sport or outside of sport. And for me, something really challenging but interesting that I experienced was going from a rugby environment where everybody's in the same place. You're in the training center, coaches, staff, athletes, chefs, sports science and medicine, sport cleaners. And you have this kind of shared culture and shared ethos. And in rugby, it is very, very direct. If you do something that could be better, you will get told by somebody straight away. And there's no, I've talked about defensiveness. There's no defensiveness in that. It's you listen to what they're saying and you do it because you want to be better for the team. And also, you know that improving yourself is better for yourself because you're more likely to get picked and earn more money and have a better career, etc. When I transitioned into my role at GB Snowsports sort of 4 or 5 years ago, bearing in mind I was right sort of at a junior level, it was a lot more sort of corporate business, and the timing of it as well was during COVID. So a lot of the meetings, well, a vast majority of the meetings that I was having were on the screen virtually. So that was a challenge in itself, but also the etiquette around providing feedback in business settings is very, very different to the direct rugby. You see something, you say it straight away. And I'm not a sociopath. I have reasonably good social skills. So I knew that wasn't appropriate to do on calls. But after days and weeks of sitting and watching people who were above me essentially making what I deemed were bad decisions, I had to start sort of saying things and pointing things out. And it took me a long time to learn how to critique in a constructive manner in a business environment, because it's just so different to how you would do it in an actual sports environment on the ground. And it's the same with skiing and snowboarders. Like the coaches speak very directly to the athletes because it's coaching. But as probably most people listening will understand, that isn't how it necessarily works in an office or on a Teams call. It's far more nuanced and it takes more time. And I have had to learn to be very, very patient in terms of coaching the people around me and affecting changes, because it can't always just be a person telling you to do something different and then they go off and do it. It's humans that, and in fact, I've only just got sort of thought this now, I've started speaking. But when you have athletes who are just supremely dedicated 24/7 to being better, that's very different to even somebody who loves working in sport, a program manager who comes and does their job and then goes home. You have to deliver that critique in a very different way, because that isn't their life. That's just one part of their life. It's their job. And I think that's probably something that most professional athletes could do with being taught, or being, I'm kind of just speaking as I'm thinking here, but it's something that probably is really useful, because most professional athletes will come out of their careers with an enormous wealth of value and experience that could be useful in business, in sport, but it's kind of extracting that information in a positive manner. A little bit like when somebody leaves the armed forces, they have all this skill and experience, but they're not necessarily used to civilian life. And it has surprised me how few athletes, relatively speaking, transition into kind of upper management roles in sport. It obviously happens a lot, but I would say the percentage is relatively low.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting, and you have a lot of athletes mention some type of identity crisis when they stop playing, because that's what you mentioned in the beginning there. But as you mentioned, it's so important that how can you transition, because all the skills that they have learned, into a different field, because it's important for them to have a purpose after their career, but also so much value that can be brought into a business setting.
Yeah, exactly. And it's almost like there's a huge untapped resource there, because there are huge numbers of athletes retiring all the time that have no idea what to do, and lots of organizations that would really desire talented people with all this experience. And I know that certain corporations have structures and programs in place for that, but I think that there could be much better opportunities put in place that would benefit everybody.
Yeah. I know I read a stat from women's sport that the C-suite executives that are women, something like 95% have played sports like in their lives. I don't know what the percentage on the men's side is, but it just shows that like so much knowledge that you can gain through sport can be used and very valuable in a business setting.
Yeah, absolutely.
Really interesting take. I'm glad you brought it up. Kearnan, thank you so much for taking the time to be on the podcast. It was fantastic.
Great. Yeah, really nice chatting to you, Marcus.
Thank you for listening to the Sports Management Podcast. Please hit the subscribe button so you don't miss out on any upcoming episodes. Also, feel free to leave a comment about what you thought about this episode. If you want to get in contact with me, send an email to sportsmpodcast@gmail.com or hit me up on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram @sportsmpodcast.